And I'm Liz Hayes. Tonight on 60 Minutes...
Shoot straight, you bastards!
Australian hero or British war criminal?
He shot him in the back.
Solving the Breaker Morant mystery.
I know a dirty case when I see one.
The campaign to clear Breaker's name.
A terrible travesty of justice.
Now the fight has gone all the way to Buckingham Palace.
The buck stops right there with Her Majesty.
As Australians, we're raised on the notion of a fair go. If we think that someone's been hard done by, we'll do whatever it takes to set things right, even if the injustice happened in another country and more than a century ago. Now, you might remember the classic, iconic movie Breaker Morant. The Breaker and his army mate Peter Hancock were tried and executed during the last days of South Africa's Boer War. At the time, the Brits portrayed them as cold-blooded killers, and many still passionately believe that. But there are others who claim that they were mere scapegoats for the Empire. And all these years on, they're now fighting to win our boys an official pardon. It's an intriguing story that spans 3 continents across more than 100 years. It's an epic tale of war and justice that asks whether one can ever truly exist alongside the other.
When we think about the Aussie spirit and where it came from, I believe it was forged in South Africa, not in Gallipoli, not in the Western Front, in South Africa.
Nick, that's a big call.
Big call. And the Breaker Morant story is full of big calls.
Shoot straight, you bastards! Don't make a mess of it!
Harry Breaker Morant was your classic Aussie digger who left home to fight in the brutal Boer War of the late 1890s. But his conviction for killing prisoners and his execution at the hands of the same British army that he'd served have earned Breaker Morant an infamous place in our history.
Ever since the first word came back from South Africa that these guys had been shot, something didn't smell right, and the court of public opinion has never been convinced.
A psychopath or a political scapegoat? After all these years, that question may finally be put to rest. There's now a demand for a full pardon. The fight to clear the Breaker's name has been put forward by the Australian government. It's gone all the way to the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace.
If it means that the British made errors in law, they should be held accountable. If it means that the British had ulterior motives to execute these men, then they should be held accountable.
They make an odd couple, but these 2 blokes are prepared to shout this historic injustice from the rooftops.
But it's time to hold people accountable.
It's a campaign led by Jim Uncles, a defence lawyer and officer in the Royal Australian Navy Reserve.
Scapegoats of the Empire.
And Nick Blazinski is a rampaging Scottish-Australian journalist.
We are asking the British government to overturn their convictions.
Do you think you know what happened?
I think I do. I think I'm closer than anyone else has ever been to the truth of the matter.
It was over a century ago that 16,000 young Aussie boys volunteered to come here to South Africa and fight the Boers. They finished up down there, what was then called the Northern Transvaal, one of the wildest, most remote parts in the whole British Empire.
They were just blokes from the bush. They'd had a roll-up. The bands had marched through all the dusty towns in Australia and said, young men, this is your chance to serve your country. It's a chance for Australia to prove it's worthy of being part of the British Empire.
And of course, among them was the legendary Breaker Morant, an enigmatic, well-educated Englishman who became a womanising, hard-drinking Aussie larrikin who went off to fight the last great war of the British Empire.
He was a bush poet.
The night's a trifle chilly, and the stars are very bright.
He was a horse breaker. He rode the most dangerous horse that ever came out of the bush in Australia.
It was a bloody battle for the gold and diamond riches of South Africa. In its final stages, Morant, along with his Aussie mates, the so-called Bushveld Carbineers, were left to mop up the remnants of Dutch Boer farmers. It was a full-blooded war, that most Australians came to know through the classic 1980s film Breaker Morant, with Edward Woodward as the Breaker. Brian Brown plays Peter Hancock, the amorous blacksmith from Bathurst.
Worst thing about dying, no more girls.
They fought a guerrilla war down there, a dirty war, almost without rules. They were part of the biggest army the Brits had ever pulled together. Yet out of 450,000 men, Lord Kitchener, who was the supreme British commander, selected 3 Australians, 3 Aussies who'd come here to fight for Queen and for Empire. And he charged them with war crimes and he sentenced them to death. Lieutenant Breaker Morant insisted until the very end that all he'd done was follow orders, the orders from Kitchener himself.
Not guilty.
Not guilty.
Morant, Hancock and a 3rd Australian, Lieutenant George Whitten, were charged with shooting Boer farmers. Their trial was a travesty and held in secret. Morant and Hancock were found guilty and executed.
I know a dirty case when I see one.
Military lawyer Jim Uncles has studied Breaker's mistreatment by the British with a keen legal eye. He believes that they were executed just to appease the Boer commanders in the dying days of the war.
No notice of their arrest, no notice of their trial, no notice of their execution. And indeed, the Australian government wasn't advised of their arrest or execution.
But you know, historians, military historians, the War Memorial, the RSL, nobody agrees with you.
That's fine. They're entitled to their view. I say that after 108 years of inaction and silence, something has to be done.
Now, what Jim the Crusader has done, with Nick the historian, is petition the British Parliament, and ultimately the Queen, to rewrite the ending of the Breaker Morant story.
After 5 years of research, I concluded that Morant and Hancock were indeed scapegoats. Scapegoats for Lord Kitchener's murderous policy, basically. Kitchener had undoubtedly, in my mind, given orders to take no prisoners. It was being practiced quite widely in South Africa, but the minute that it threatened to become public, Kitchener was never going to allow that fact to come out.
But there's another highly emotional side to this saga in South Africa.
Welcome to Bushveld Carbon News Breaker Morant.
Thank you.
We've brought Jim and Nick here to face Charles Leach. A passionate, 5th-generation Afrikaan, Leach runs tours of the Boer War battlefield.
But if they're tried wrongly, if they're not tried in accordance with the law, and they are selectively picked out of a whole bunch, a whole gallery of guilty people, and then executed. No, let me finish. No.
My ancestors died here. The children and the girls and the boys, and they died in the war. That's what, to me, counts.
Yes, absolutely.
Travel across the sweeping veldt of the Transvaal, which looks a lot like Australia, and you can understand their bitterness. This is a landscape littered with graves and ghosts, with memorials and bad memories. The British burned down 30,000 Boer homesteads and they destroyed the farms. Even more horrific were their concentration camps, in which 27,000 South African women and children died.
And this was the worst of the camps?
This one was known as Hell Camp. It had the highest percentage of deaths per inmate. Most of them children.